I'm not sure if this is the right place to tell my story. I'm not sure if there is a right place. Maybe that's why I waited so long. Maybe that's just an excuse. Maybe I'm just scared. I worked for the National Park Service for 3 years. I wasn't out in the trees though. Unfortunately, my story isn't going to be that exciting. My official title was Administrative Specialist. I helped organize government-funded programs and prepared written documents related to those programs. I was good at my job. I was fired unceremoniously 15 months ago. I wish I could say that my removal from the service was a mystery. I know exactly why they let me go. I saw too much. 12,307. Even though I know it's higher now, that's the number I remember. I couldn't scrub it from my brain if I tried. For 8 months, the Science and Research Division of the Park Service was collaborating with an independent study group. I handled the paperwork for this partnership almost exclusively. Waivers, NDAs, and population registries for the fauna in our country's national parks. There were some odd additions for sure. Why were the members of the Park Service signing liability waivers? Asking those questions wasn't my job. I didn't know enough about the Science and Research Division to begin a debate with them either. I trusted that the Park Service knew what they were doing and tried not to get hung up on the details. Then the injuries began. I'm not sure when they started or how many people were hurt before I became aware of it. The first few incidents, I now know, only involved the study group that I mentioned before. Without members of the Park Service involved, I had no reason to be notified. When the first ranger returned from the Everglades with a broken leg, I started paying attention. The ranger was part of a team documenting the population growth of the Virginia possum. I'd never heard of a possum breaking someone's leg. I had to file the details of the incident along with an insurance claim and a copy of the liability waiver signed by the ranger in question. That's how I knew the doctor had cited the source of the ranger's injury as an animal attack. That's how I saw the pictures. The ranger was mauled. When I started asking questions, I was only reminded of their official position, documenting the population growth of the Virginia possum. There were 3 more attacks over those 8 months. I knew by then not to announce my suspicions. Whatever was going on in our parks, no one wanted to talk about it. Instead, I stuck to the documents. When the research project concluded, it was time to bid our independent partners farewell. I had to provide them with the original copies of every recorded incident related to the research. I did exactly as I was told. I prepared the pile of paperwork, and when I was asked to combine it with the folders brought into the office by the independent regime, I didn't hesitate. But I couldn't stop myself from peeking at their information either. The corner of one specific document was protruding from the edge of an unlabeled black folder. It must have come loose from the paperclip holding the rest of the folder's contents together. I tugged it along until I could read the heading, Unidentified Species. I remember how cold I felt when I read those words. The sweat on my brow turned to ice. I didn't know that the Park District was involved with anything involving new or unusual forms of wildlife. I pulled on the paper a little more. Information spilled out of the folder, one line at a time. New encounters, 7. There was a range of dates alongside that number. Those 7 new encounters had taken place over the research period that I was involved in. Injuries, 9. The Park District only had 4 documented injuries. The other 5, I expect, belonged to the independent company. Why had they kept that secret? Where were those injured parties? Total encounters, 12,307. My heart sank. There wasn't a range of dates next to that line. I didn't know how long this company had been studying the unidentified species in our jurisdiction. Had the Park Service been involved from the beginning? Why weren't these encounters, these injuries, or these new species being discussed with the community at large? I lost my composure after that. All discreet intentions vanished. I opened the folder where it sat. My eyes briefly passed over a collection of photographs. They looked to be screenshots from trail cams. One of them was a Polaroid. In each picture was a shape that I didn't recognize. Animals for sure, mammals mostly. They were either moving too fast in the photos, or my glance at them was too brief, but I couldn't decipher any of those species. A hand suddenly slammed the folder shut. It was a member of our science and research team. When they spoke, they did so in a hushed panic. They told me to forget what I saw and urged me away from the area. I later saw them handing the folder and my paperwork to a member of the independent party. They were scared when they caught me. I doubt that they were worried solely about my safety. I think the knowledge I gained at that moment could have put the entire park district at risk. That's what's so frightening. What could they do to us? A government body who has superiority over the park districts in the park that we manage. My termination arrived swiftly after that. I expected it to be accompanied by an NDA, but there wasn't one there. I guess the administrative specialists they had got to replace me overlooked that detail. I can't be punished for sharing this information now, can I? I now know that these parks are dangerous. They have been for years. But am I in danger too? I remember the night vividly. It was damp and brisk. We had just had a rainstorm, but it was one of those summer rainstorms that made everything warm, but cold. You know, the types where the wind is what makes you shiver. I had been called out to look for a dog that was roaming the neighborhood near a cemetery. The cemetery wasn't big, it was actually pretty small, but the dog had been scaring some of the people in the area. I was part of an animal control team. We had plenty of experience with handling stray dogs, so it wasn't an unusual call. The only thing that seemed odd was that the people said the dog was extremely massive. So to me, this sounded more like a wolf than a dog, but we really can't make any assumptions. We were told to go locate the dog and bring it into custody. I hadn't been to the area before. It was a strange town that was very remote, but it was still a type of suburban area. I could definitely see why a large canine would be threatening to the people there, but I still had my suspicions that we were looking for something that was not a domesticated dog. My partner and I drove around the town. There were lots of small shops. Most of them seemed to be family-owned. There were a couple of candy shops, an ice cream shop, and some pizza, things like that. Truthfully, it was making me hungry, so I wanted to find this animal quickly so we could finally get some dinner. I remembered telling myself, I'll have to remember this place. I'd really like to take a stroll down here on one of my days off. We didn't find the canine near the shops, so we started combing the neighborhood close to it. It was hard to see much. Many of the homes had plenty of bushes and trees. I wouldn't doubt it if we had been in the same vicinity as the hound. We just couldn't spot it. So we drove back and forth, up and down those streets. We had spent at least an hour and a half doing this. We were starting to get a bit frustrated. That's when we got a lucky break. One of the people in the neighborhood must have seen us driving their streets aimlessly, so they flagged us down. The man said that they had seen the hound roaming near the cemetery on the south side. I asked the man how big the dog was. He said that it was extremely large. that its fur was pitch black and that they noticed its eyes were glowing, like a deer's caught in the headlights of your car. We thanked the man and proceeded to drive towards the cemetery. The cemetery was very small, but it had plenty of large trees and bushes, just like the neighborhood had. It was getting darker, so things were made more difficult. It wasn't normal to do this, but my partner and I decided that we might have a better chance finding it on foot. This way, we'd be able to scavenge around the bushes and trees and use our flashlights. We were both nervous. If the canine was as big as everyone said it was, we wouldn't be very safe out in the open. And if it was, in fact, a wolf, like I had thought, we wouldn't be in a very good position with it. So we stayed close to each other, and I did bring some things to our defense, whistles and things like that. We circled around the outskirts of the cemetery first. We just needed to get a good look around the perimeter before we went straight into it. We didn't see anything at first. We just assumed it might have left the area. But then, as soon as we start to head back around, we see a black mass sitting in the middle of one of the streets between the neighborhood and the cemetery. And all I could smell was that fragrant burnt smell of an old campfire. I yelled to my colleague, but I kept front-facing the canine. I didn't want to take my eyes off of it. At first glance, the dark mass seemed to be average-sized, but as I continued to examine it, I noticed that the canine was actually laying flush to the ground. It wasn't standing. My colleague asks if I think it's a dog. I told them I wasn't sure, that it was still a bit too far for me to make a proper estimation on the size of the animal. That's when the mass stands, and it was indisputably large. Its eyes are glowing, just as the man said, and it walks slowly away to the neighborhood and disappears. It walked like we were not any type of threat whatsoever. It was smart, this animal, so we had to be extra careful. We followed the animal's path into the neighborhood. We looked around. We didn't see it, but what we did find was a strange black smudge. It was very large in size, and it appeared to be the spot where the hound was sitting. It smelt like charred wood, but there was no sign of the animal. It was getting really late. We were exhausted and hungry, but we knew we had to get the animal off the streets. But after following an animal that seemed to simply vanish from our sight, it seemed like we needed more eyes. We made our way back to the van, and I called for more assistance. We had another team meet us, and we searched more. I had described the animal to the other team. They looked confused, but they didn't suggest that we had been fabricating anything. We reached well into the next day without ever finding another trace of the hound. Eventually, my boss called and said it was time to leave the area, that the animal must have moved to a new territory. We were never called back to find the animal, so I often wonder, what ever happened to it? After college, I got a temporary administrative job working with the local law enforcement. It was a 6-month contract and paid well, so I was glad to get it. I found a furnished apartment that let me rent month to month. It was on the top floor of a 3-story building. It was pretty big and had nice hardwood floors. The walls were kind of thin, and I could hear my neighbor sometimes, especially at night when it was quiet. When I first moved in, I knocked on the neighbor's door a few times to introduce myself, but they never answered, even though I thought I had heard them inside. I figured they didn't like answering the door if they weren't expecting somebody. Anyway, I just slipped a note under the door saying hello and giving my name. I worked with the same officers all the time on rotating shifts. After I'd been there a few weeks, I was on the evening shift, which meant I got to go home around 2 a.m. One night I was heading down the hallway of my building and saw a light from under my neighbor's door, and I saw the shadow of feet under the door. It looked like the people had gone dark, as if they heard me and were looking to see who was in the hall. I figured if they wanted to say hello, they would have opened the door. So I kind of waved and went into my apartment. Over the next couple of weeks, this happened 3 to 4 times. It seemed like I had a reclusive but nosy neighbor. One night after work, I got into bed and heard my neighbor moving around in their room on the other side of my bedroom wall. The noises got louder, and I started getting worried. They'd never been that loud, and it almost sounded like they were being attacked or having a heart attack and knocking things over. I ran out and banged on their door, but they didn't answer. I called out saying I was worried, and if they didn't answer, I'd call for help. Still, no answer. I ran to my apartment and called the police station and asked my coworker to send someone over. I'd headed down to the lobby to wait for the officer, who showed up within 5 minutes. I'd gotten to know him a bit, and we went up and knocked on the door, but still no answer. I took him into my apartment, and we could still hear the loud thumps every 5 to 10 seconds, and then a huge bang. The officer asked if I could contact the building manager to open the door. I called her up. Luckily, she was a night owl and was up watching TV. I told her what was happening, and she said she'd head over. She lived close by. She got there and asked which apartment it was. I told her 306. She looked at me weirdly and said 306 was empty. I said I heard my neighbor making noise almost every night. The officer said he had heard the noises too and asked if 306 was the apartment that was above the carport. She said it was. He said someone could have climbed onto the carports and maybe there were squatters in an empty apartment. The manager unlocked the door. The apartment was dark, and she turned on the light. The officer went into the bedroom and came back, saying it was empty. The place was spotless. All but 2 of the windows were locked, and there was no sign of squatters. We stood there, confused. The officer said, "You're not crazy. I heard the banging too." I said maybe we scared them off, and they'd left through the unlocked windows. We locked the 2 windows, and on our way out, I looked down and saw the note I had slipped under the door a few weeks earlier. I said I'd let them know if the noises kept up. A few weeks later, when I was on the evening shift again, I got home about 2 a.m. and saw the light under the door of 306. I went into my bedroom and heard the thumping next door. I called for an officer to come out and called my building manager. A different officer showed up, and I knew him too. The manager arrived and unlocked the door. The officer went in, and everything checked out. The windows were all locked. I apologized and tried to rationalize it, but there was definitely no good explanation. A few weeks later, the apartment was rented out, and I got the chance to meet my new neighbors. I told them to keep an eye out because we thought maybe squatters had been getting in. I've told them what had been happening my last week there. The station had a barbecue, and we were talking about the squatters that no one ever saw. I told the officer about the second call out and how all the windows were locked that time, but I knew I'd seen the light on and heard thumping. He asked if I wanted to hear something strange. He said he was going to tell me earlier, but didn't want to freak me out. He said that 3 months before I moved in, he personally responded to a call to my neighbor's apartment for a suicide. The person had hung himself and was unconscious. It seemed like they might have panicked, and a chair and a lamp and side table had been knocked over, like they had been kicking out in every direction. Unfortunately, they passed away before getting to the hospital. I just stared at him in disbelief. I asked the building manager about it the day I moved out and asked why she hadn't told me. She said it wasn't policy to bring up stuff like that. I don't know if it would have helped or not to be told about it, and I still can't even believe it.